Right, hello folks. This is lecture 17, and today we are looking at a new topic, the topic of phenomenology. Now, first of all, the new philosophy that carries the name of phenomenology arose in the 19th century in Western European thought, and became eventually, especially with the spread of existentialist ideas, became extremely popular and has become one of the dominant forms of Western European philosophizing. The man who is largely responsible for that is Edmund Husserl. Husserl was a German thinker, a German Jew actually, and that's going to be significant later on. Right? He was a German Jew, and he came up with the notion that philosophizing essentially is a phenomenological task. Now, first of all, what is phenomenology? It's a term that we have been visiting from time to time. It's really a difficult term to understand, and Husserl is one of the more difficult philosophers that we do have to deal with. The term is first encountered in Kantian theory. It's fundamental to Kantian theory, the notion of the phenomena. Remember that Kant, in responding to Hume, had drawn a radical distinction between the noumenon on the one hand, singular, and the phenomenon on the other, singular, or noumena, plural, and phenomena. He says that the noumena are things as they exist in themselves, and they are unknowable. There's no way in which we can investigate them. There's no way in which we can describe essentially what constitutes phenomena. Because all we are acquainted with, all that we have access to, are the impressions, as Hume had pointed out, made on the mind, on the consciousness of the observer. And therefore, all that we can talk about and all that we can have any certitude about will be the phenomena that we identify within our consciousness. Now, Kant did not call his own philosophizing a phenomenological type of discourse or investigation or inquiry. Sorry, Kant did not call his own method of philosophical inquiry a phenomenology. He was investigating human reason, right? And human reason under Kant became quite a complex phenomenon, as we remember. But the term reappeared in Hegel, and Hegel, in fact, Hegel's major book, the one in which he unfolds the nature of the dialectic and the historical method, and the way in which the absolute spirit undergoes changes, is not static, right? It's never the same, but grows and develops and undergoes changes. In that book, the title of that book actually is The Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel clearly, like Berkeley, as I said earlier, saw the problem of consciousness as a problem that had to be explained and dealt with in terms of absolute consciousness and not the individual consciousness of what Kant called the transcendental subject. It was an absolute consciousness, in a sense, a consciousness of God or being itself. So the term appears, therefore, in Hegel, and it's employed to define the nature of the absolute. When we come to Husserl, however, Husserl returns back to the Kantian transcendental subjectivity. And what he is doing is that he is like Descartes. He's trying to find a foundation for philosophical thought. He's trying to find a foundation for the ascertaining of truth. What precisely is truth? How do we begin to understand and derive an understanding of truth? Let us get to the foundations. In fact, there's a sense in which Husserl is trying to recapitulate the philosophical beginnings of the Cartesian method, but he avoids Descartes' systematic doubt. He comes up with something that to my mind is very close to it, but as far as he's concerned, it's radically different. He avoids the notion of systematic doubt and the rationalistic attempt to rebuild all knowledge on the basis of self-certainty, because when Descartes doubts the existence of everything, Descartes can only arrive at a certainty of the self, of the doubting, of the process of doubting, or of the I that doubts, the I that thinks. And therefore Descartes begins with that with that ego, that central ego, right? That the subject, right, of consciousness, and through a rationalistic procedure, he's able to rebuild the whole edifice of knowledge that he deliberately discarded and rejected through the method of systematic doubt. Husserl is doing something very similar. And what he says is that what we need to do, right, is to develop a phenomenology in which we entirely discard the existence of noumena. He's not concerned with the Kantian noumena. He says, all that registers on my mind are phenomena, impressions that come from the external world. That to me is truth, and that to me is what I must deal with as a rational consciousness. He returns to the concept of that transcendental subjectivity that is spoken about by Kant, and he examines that transcendental subjectivity to see to what extent it can reveal to him an understanding of those phenomena. And he seeks to arrive at a knowledge of the essences of those phenomena. That's what he claims, the essences, the ideas, the general ideas, the universal ideas that underlie, right, his cognition of phenomena that enters his mind from the external world. His method is a method that is referred to as pure phenomenology. And it clearly is an epistemological enterprise. He's concerned with knowledge. He concentrates exclusively on knowledge. And it is clear that his enterprise is an enterprise that continues that Cartesian emphasis on the priority of epistemology, right, in a philosophical undertaking. And he says that what we need to do is that we need to we need to be engaged in a certain kind of reduction, which he calls phenomenological reduction. Phenomenological reduction, and he uses a Greek term, epoche, E-P-O-C-H-E, with an accent on the E. The word is in the notes, right? That philosophical epoche or reduction first involves a bracketing out of the natural attitude. Now, the natural attitude is the attitude whereby we look at the external world and make an underlying assumption, tacit or not, conscious or not, we make an underlying assumption that that is the real world that we're dealing with. And there's a reality attached to the things outside of us. And he's not condemning that attitude and saying it is meaningless. What he is saying is that for the phenomenological task, for the reduction or the epoche to take place, what I need to do is to bracket out the natural attitude, bracket out the things of the external world, and concentrate exclusively on the impressions that I receive from that external world. And there I'm searching for essences. I'm searching for meanings. I am searching for common structures that define that, that define the phenomena that I'm investigating. There are some things that he comes up with. There are some structures that he comes up with. And one of the structures he comes up with is something that he derived from a philosopher called Brentano, right? And that is the concept of intentionality. Actually, it is a very ancient term that comes from medieval philosophy. But Brentano's intentionality, he seems as defining the structure of the phenomena that I am examining deep in my transcendental subjectivity or inner consciousness. Intentionality really is a structure whereby the objects of my knowledge, the things that I claim to know, the phenomena that I investigate and examine and perceive within the mind, all intend towards an object in the external world. Intending, right? They point to, they focus on, they are directed to. That is what intentionality is about. So that when I look at the phenomena that I am investigating, one of the structures that I'm confronted with is the intentionality of my perceptions. When I'm perceiving the external world, I'm perceiving the phenomena in my mind, but the phenomena always points to that external world. Now, to my mind, I don't see how this is not a return to the same world that he brackets out, and a return to an examination of Kantian noumena. But he claims that it is not, right? And within that world, right, that intends within that world of phenomena that intends the external world, facts and values are prevalent, right? Husserl is not prepared to establish that radical Humean distinction between fact and value. They're all phenomena in my mind, and they occupy essentially an even status, right? So that these are the essences that I confront when I look at the phenomena that I cognize from the external world. He says, in discovering my life world is the world within which I exist, and the world that I'm perceiving and cognizing through the reception of these phenomena into consciousness. That is a world that I must avoid explaining with all of the various theories that are used in the scientific world or in the philosophical realm. I must describe things as they are perceived, and I must not resort to theorization or speculation or hypothesis or metaphysical arguments and so on in order to describe the phenomena of the external world. And that essentially is what the pure phenomenology of Edmund Husserl consists of. Eventually, towards the end of his career, he wrote a very, very significant book, very interesting book, a book called The Crisis of European Sciences and Existential Phenomenology. Now, the pure phenomenology that he had been dealing with is a phenomenology that I said was essentially constituted by an epistemological investigation. It really belonged to the area of epistemology. But what happens in the crisis of European sciences and existential phenomenology is that Husserl resorts to a different kind of phenomenological enterprise, one that has to do not just with the structures of phenomena, but the very structures of existence itself. His existential phenomenology is pointing to the life world, the life world in which we exist. And that is a real world. And one of the things he bemoans in that life world, and in fact, the book is devoted to a very thorough philosophical investigation of that. One of the things that he bemoans is the dualism that characterizes that world. Right? When we look at European culture, at European consciousness, when we look at the whole philosophical enterprise and the growth of the sciences and humanities and so on, we are seeing a radical cleavage, a split in that world, a split on the one hand between the sciences and the humanities, right? And that split is still continues. We still define the methodologies of the sciences as radically different than the methodologies of the humanities, the arts and the sciences. A further split against between inner and outer, something that he tried to overcome, right? In the earlier books he had written, his Cartesian meditations and his ideas, what I was talking about when I talked about pure phenomenology. These are the books that he had written, the ideas and Cartesian meditations, right? He had tried to overcome that problem of inner and outer, but it is a problem that European mind is plagued by, that fundamental distinction, a distinction between the subjective and the objective, subjective truths on the one hand, and objective truths on the other. The truths of the real world, the truths that we can validate through examination, investigation, inquiry, experimentation, observation, and the inner truths that I cannot perceive and investigate myself. The split between mathematics and physics on the one hand. In fact, this is a further split within the sciences between mathematics and physics, the split between fact and value. And so in the crisis, Husserl is really bemoaning that radical cleavage within the European consciousness, and something that he tries to overcome, but I'm not sure that he succeeds in. Now, Husserl had laid the foundations for a new kind of philosophical inquiry. And the student, Martin Heidegger, was to take that methodology to a different dimension entirely. Martin Heidegger was a student of Husserl and was very impressed with the Husserlian method. In fact, the first book he wrote was dedicated to Husserl. Heidegger was German, belonging to the same university as Husserl. And Heidegger adopted Husserl's existential phenomenology, not the pure phenomenological method, but its existential phenomenology, to turn philosophy in a radically different direction. Remember when we were dealing with the moderns, I said that there was an epistemological turn in Western thought and Western consciousness with the emergence of philosophers like Descartes, the rationalistic tradition of Western Europe, and even the Anglo-Saxon tradition of empiricism, that there was to a large extent a concentration almost exclusively, not in all cases, but almost exclusively, on the issue of knowledge. How do I know? What constitutes knowledge? That is what we refer to as the epistemological turn. Heidegger himself is very, very much concerned about that and bemoans the epistemological turn in Western European consciousness. And he says that what we need to do is to go back to pre-Socratic philosophy, a philosophy which is primarily concerned with centers, focuses, privileges, ontological issues, issues of being, and not epistemological issues, issues of knowing. Remember that there was that movement in Greek philosophy when we came to people like Protagoras and the sophists, to concentrate largely on the human and to abandon the search for an understanding of things as they exist in the world out there. What constitutes the basis of reality, not knowledge, but reality. Heidegger is arguing that that is true philosophy, and we need to go back, right, to our ontological investigations into the nature of being. And that essentially is prior to any consideration or concern for issues of knowledge. And he wrote a very interesting book, the same book that I mentioned he dedicated to his teacher Husserl, a book called Being and Time. Being and Time has become one of the major documents of Western European philosophy. In fact, Heidegger is regarded by Western Europeans as the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. And when we come to the British, we'll see that the British have another selection. But Heidegger is regarded as the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and he can justifiably lay claim to that, because there was a radically new turn in philosophical discourse coming from the pen of Heidegger, certainly in the book entitled Being and Time. And Heidegger had a powerful impact on most of the philosophical undertakings in the 20th century in Western Europe. The whole question, the whole school of existential philosophers, for example, largely adopted the Heideggerian method of inquiry, the method of existential phenomenology, in order to investigate the nature of human being, and in order to establish a certain kind of worldview that concentrated primarily and began primarily in an investigation of the life world of the individual. Husserl is, again, like so many of our other philosophers that we have looked at, Husserl was a Jesuit seminarian. I notice I have not said a Jesuit monk. He didn't stay long enough to become a monk, but he was educated as a Jesuit. And eventually turned to philosophy. He turned to lecturing in philosophy, became a professor of it, and left the Jesuit, right, the Jesuit order. But he was trained as a Jesuit, and very much of the Husserlian system bears the imprint of that Jesuit influence. What he says is that we ought to return, right, to an understanding and a cognition of being, not beings. Very often one makes a distinction between beings, which are objects or states of affairs, if you wish, in the real world. These are beings. The table is a being, an objective being. The man walking down the road is also a being. We have beings not only in the life world, the world of living beings, but we have beings as objects in the external world, rocks and trees and so on. And so very often our concentration is on beings. Science is only concerned with beings, for example, examining beings, understanding them. But he says beyond beings, we have to look at being itself, the basis, the structure, right, of the many beings that we conceive and recognize in the external world. And so Heidegger, right, abandons the Cartesian cogito. He rejects the Cartesian cogito. He rejects the Kantian and even the Husserlian transcendental subject or transcendental subjectivity as the center of knowing. And he concludes, and clearly he is influenced here heavily by Hegel, right? When you read Heidegger, sometimes you feel that you're getting a recasting, a revisioning of the Hegelian system, right? He's pointing to something that is far beyond the human. He talks about human subjectivity as Dasein, right? D-A-S-E-I-N. Dasein means being there. It's being just thrown out, right, into a spatio-temporal reality or spatio-temporal domain. Being, the human being, human subjectivity is aware of being. He refers to it as a clearing in being. And that human being really has to be seen not as a separate and distinct cogito or transcendental subject cut off from the real world and turning on the real world to understand it, to perceive it, and to examine it. That's not how we should understand our own existence, but as a clearing in being, a locality within which, as it were, being cognizes itself. And that my being, the being of Dasein, is a being in the world. And that term is a hyphenated term, a being in the world. Right? That being in the world, right, my own being in the world is really separate and distinct from the being of natural objects. And he refers to natural objects as things at hand, Things at hand is also a hyphenated term, right? And there are other kinds of beings in the world, beings that human beings have made, and beings or objects that human beings have manufactured or made. And he calls them things ready to hand, things that I'm using, right? So they are the things at hand and the things ready to hand, man-made objects that constitute beings in the world, right? And that is opposed to Dasein. Dasein not only looks at them, in most of the other philosophical system, all that Dasein does is perceive them. But in the Heideggerian system, Dasein does not only perceive, Dasein uses them. And in using them, brings them into the world of Dasein on the one hand, establishes an inseparable linkage between himself and things that exist in the other world, and points essentially to the ultimate structure of being itself. Now, Dasein was heavily influenced by Kierkegaard. Remember, we dealt with Kierkegaard earlier, and we saw that Kierkegaard was trying to re-Christianize Christendom, that he centered the religious, right? The religious as essentially the most authentic manifestation of the human, right? When we the law of the three stages in Kierkegaard, we move from the aesthetic, right, to the ethical, and then to the religious. That is an attempt to discover what my real, my authentic being really is. And so when Kierkegaard was very much concerned with the restoration of the human, right, from the fear and trembling and the negative emotions and experiences of dread and anxiety and stress and so on. Heidegger is concerned with authentic being, the authentic being of Dasein, right? And in that respect, he's heavily influenced by Kierkegaard, and he's looking at what he calls mood. Kierkegaard also looks at feelings and emotions and so on. But this is a radical departure from the rationalistic method or from the empirical method. In the rationalistic method, reason is central as a definition of what constitutes a human. In the empirical method, reason is not ignored, but perception and our sensory equipment is what gives us access to the world of reality. In the Heideggerian system, however, very much like the existentialists, although he claimed he was not an existentialist, in the Heideggerian system, it is mood that is significant. And what Heidegger does in Being and Time is that he examines a number of different moods. Talks about our being towards death, for example. Very fundamental that, we are beings that are oriented towards that terminal end, that end which in a way gives ultimate meaning to our lives. Remember that it is death that in a sense gives meaning to our lives. It is how we die that determines how we are perceived and evaluated in life, right? If we do something very horrible before, then that will determine essentially how we will be viewed, right? So our being is in the world is simultaneously a being towards death. And that consciousness of our being towards death is a mood that we have to take into account as we evaluate and describe the nature of the life world in which we live. In this world, we develop various modes of being or ways of being, which he calls existentialia, right? Or existentialia, in fact, ways of being. We have certain kinds of dispositions, certain kinds of life situations, right? Our ways of being are multiple. For example, many of us will be simultaneously mothers and fathers. That's a whole world in itself. That's a way of being that, in a sense, demands our complete commitment, right, to the functions, obligations, and responsibilities of parenthood. Or we might be teachers within a school. And again, that modality of being, that way of being, it makes significant demands on the totality, right, of who we are, of our Dasein. We've got to make preparations for our classes. We've got to work with our students. We've got to try to assist them in understanding, in acquiring knowledge and understanding the world, right? We've got to measure them and the work that they do in terms of correction of papers. It is a way of being that we have got to take into account. Or it may be the political reality within which we live, another way of being, right? We may find ourselves very much involved in politics. We may not be ourselves members of parliament or candidates going up for election, but very often we are involved, not just through voting, but through campaigning, through supporting MPs and so on in their campaigning, candidates in their campaigning. And we have a commitment to that. Or we may be religious people and belong to a religion and given a sense of totality of our life and our resources to that religion, right? So these are various ways of being that we develop. Dasein is very much occupied in the world, occupied not only with things at hand and things ready to hand, but he's also occupied in developing these ways of being. And very often what determines his response, right, to those callings is really the call of conscience. Conscience becomes central in the Heideggerian system, right? That call of conscience. We have to try to overcome many of them. And again, here you can see the clear influence of Kierkegaard, feelings of guilt and feelings of anguish, right? Very often the term for anguish, the German term for anguish is used in the English literature, A-N-G-S-T, angst, right? The overcoming of guilt and the overcoming of angst. And we have to try to find our authentic Dasein. And that authentic Dasein that we have to find is a Dasein that is related on the one hand to the Umwelt and to the Mitwelt. The Umwelt is the world itself, the things in the world. We have got to try and relate in an appropriate and authentic manner, not only to things in the world, but Mitwelt, our being with other people, to community, right? So there are things in the world I have got to involve myself in getting a home, buying a car, and getting appropriate clothing, and so on. That would be the Umwelt, the things in the world. Or I would want to go out into the countryside and spend some time and so on. But there's also the Mitwelt, community, my relationships with others, not only others that are near to me and close to me, but others that are even more distant from me, and the people in the larger community, mankind in the world, in a globalized society that has particular relevance because I'm relating to people in all parts of the world, right? And so in the search for Dasein, right, care becomes very important. And care is not just in terms of caring, looking after others, but care in terms of concern, worry, right? I'm a being that is filled with care, meaning worry, my concerns. These preoccupy me. Now, Heidegger believes that what we should try to do is to seek being in its authenticity. Dasein has to be a Dasein that seeks to be authentic. But very often in this world, our lives are inauthentic lives. And that inauthentic life is very often characterized by what he calls fallenness. What characterizes the life of most human beings is the condition of fallenness. And that fallenness is a fallenness into what he calls the publicity of the day, into the condition of the masses, what determines and dictates and shapes our existence, our thoughts, or feelings, or intent, sometimes even what we consider to be the call of conscience. What shapes that is an attempt to imitate, right, what we acquire, what we see, what we perceive in the public, in the realm of the public, right? The publicity of the day is what very often contaminates and destroys, right, and inhibits our search for authenticity. And so what we have got to do, and that creates what he calls the measure of self-estrangement or self-alienation, right? Speech is central to the Heideggerian notion of the significance of Dasein, because it is through speech that we articulate not only our own life world, the conditions of our own life world, but it is through human speech that being itself is able to express itself and cognize itself. Dasein is a center, it's a clearing in being, and speech becomes central. And the quality of our speech, therefore, must be of tremendous significance. Very often, what we are involved in for speech is what Heidegger calls idle talk. And I think all of us are aware and accustomed to this whole problem of idle talk. We find ourselves in a line with our fellows, and we involve ourselves in a lot of idle talk, or sometimes even within the household. We close ourselves off from each other and our deep interiorities. We are shut off from close members of the household because we are engaged in idle talk, the frivolous, the trivial, right? And so all of these are conditions of self-estrangement. All of these are experiences of inauthentic Dasein. And the individual should strive to achieve some measure of authenticity as he responds to the call of conscience and recognizes his role within the entire structure of being. Heidegger was a serious critic of modern technology. Modern technology has had its critics, right? I mean, we all, many of us continue to criticize it. We talk about the dangers of the cell phone and so on. But most of us are appreciative of the comforts, the creature comforts that we acquire by the use of technology. But Heidegger felt that technology contributed to the inauthenticity of human existence. The fact that, to a large extent, human beings are not what they ought to be, and they do not achieve their true selfhood, right? They do not respond authentically to the call of conscience because they are mesmerized, baffled by, confused by the glitter of our man-made technologies. And so there is a danger, right, in modern technology. What is interesting about Heidegger is towards the end of his life, he went to live in a German Black Forest. And he lived in a little hut there, cut himself off from the modern, sophisticated, post-war world of Western Europe, right? Heidegger's philosophy clearly is a philosophy that had a number of very significant implications for Western thought, had a powerful influence on Western existentialist philosophy, and clearly had a tremendous impact on very much of the leading philosophical theologians of the late 20th century. When you look at the writings of Heidegger, you see the imprint of his Jesuit seminarian days. What Heidegger seems to be saying is something very similar to what Christianity has been saying. The call of conscience, the struggle for inauthenticity, the nature of fallenness. Christianity talks about the fall. It talks about the centrality of the conscience, and the conscience as a dwelling place of the spirit, right? It talks about achieving true and realizing our true humanity through grace, right? So that we can once more restore the imago Dei in us, authentic being. When you look at Heidegger's description, what Heidegger seems to be doing is taking Christian theology or Jesuit theology, or taking the writings of Kierkegaard and de-theologizing them. He is de-theologizing them, right? It is a theological frame that is now replaced and repositioned within a secular setting, a secular mold. He is a secular person. He does not get into the arguments of whether there is a God or there isn't a God at all. What he talks about is being, right? And you can easily see Heidegger's being in terms of Hegel's absolute spirit, in terms of the Christian God, because Hegel saw absolute spirit essentially as another understanding, another concept, another manifestation of God, right? He has had a powerful influence on people like Barth and Bultmann and so on, people that I will be discussing in the very last lecture. But before ending the discussion on Heidegger, I need to point out that there was serious problem to the man himself. Magnificent philosophy, a philosophy that radically changed our understanding of our own personal, our human beings, a philosophy that had a potent influence and very often very positive influence on Western thought. But as an individual, there's a lot that we need to reject and to critique in the life of Heidegger. Heidegger lived during the time of the Nazi takeover, National Socialism in Germany. And he became a member of the Nazi Party. In fact, his thought was used by the Nazis in order to validate and justify what they were doing. Not only that, but the very man who educated him and who was his mentor and whom he devoted his book to, Being and Time, is the very man that he was instrumental in getting fired from the university. And he took his post in the university in the chair of philosophy. Edmund Husserl, right? Husserl was a German Jew and the Jews were persecuted. And Heidegger became one of the architects, right, of that persecution of the Jews at a very highly intellectual level within the university itself. The university was purged of its Jewish professors and its Jewish students, right? And even after the war, people who had a tremendous respect and high regard for Heideggerian philosophy were hoping that Heidegger would have repudiated that Nazi past, right? That he would have been ashamed about it and that he would have pointed out and recognized his errors. And Heidegger never did that. There are a number of people who went to visit him in his little hut in the Black Forest in Germany after the war to talk to him and to see if Heidegger would renounce and repudiate some of the things that he had stood for and he had supported. And he never did it. And so I remember reading an article where a German poet, Celan, he was a German Jew, right, went himself to visit Heidegger, right, and to find out if there was any signs of shame or guilt or remorse about his involvement in the Nazi enterprise of the Holocaust. And there was no such thing. And Celan himself withdrew, and I think he made a decision eventually not to speak German for the rest of his life. He was a German Jew, not to speak German for the rest of his life. So there are a number of things about the man himself that really problematizes the value and the quality of his work. But his work continues to be a work of tremendous influence. Now, there are two other people that I will make passing reference to because they are so very important. We can't pay attention to everybody and give the same attention to all of the philosophers of any period. But there are two other people that I would want to mention. One is Jean-Paul Sartre. Paul Sartre, in a way, was the Heidegger of France. A number of Germans, when they read Sartre, says that the problem with Sartre is that he didn't understand Heidegger. But that's an unfair kind of criticism. Sartre belonged to the 20th century, born in 1905 and died in 1980, so he's fairly recent. And Sartre was not only a philosopher, like Heidegger, he concentrated on ontology, not necessarily right on epistemology, but he came up with some different understandings about being. Heidegger's book was Being and Time, because Heidegger saw temporality as constitutive of what humanity consists of. It's fundamental to humanity, this notion of temporality or time. We are creatures of time. In Sartre, there's a radically different shift, right, in his ontological investigations and his ontological descriptions of what constitutes being. He's also concerned with being, but the name of his book is Being and Nothingness. Heidegger deals at length with issues of nothingness, right? What essentially is nothingness or nihility? It's difficult to say, right? How can you describe nothing if nothing really is what the term means, right? But Sartre has had a location for nothingness, had a description, an essence for nothingness, as it were. And Sartre saw human existence as essentially consisting, right, of a kind of synthesis of being and nothingness, since nothingness really was human consciousness, right? A human being is described essentially as a being in which there's a kind of hemorrhaging, and that hemorrhaging comes through the activity of the mind, right? The mind investigates, it examines, it inquires into. It is the exact opposite of being itself. There's a certain kind of substantiality about being, but consciousness lacks that substantiality. And when Sartre looks at the world, he's a total atheist. Heidegger never takes that position, but Sartre is a total atheist who denies the existence of God. And in fact, unlike Descartes, he says, if I exist, God cannot exist, right? He establishes the reality of human freedom. But freedom is a horrendous thing for Sartre. It is not a beautiful thing. Right? Everybody praises freedom and loves freedom. But for Sartre, freedom, we are condemned to be free, right? And the fact that we are free means that we really have no guidance, right? Sartre is not concerned with the Heideggerian call of conscience. Sartre is concerned with the reality of human freedom. And very often we have to make choices. And there are no guidelines, no guideposts, right? No roadmap that we can follow, which assist us in making the right choices. We just have to make those choices. And very often those choices can turn out to be very detrimental or lethal, right? The primary emotion that Sartre identified as characterizing the human being was what he called nausea. And he wrote a book, right? He wrote a novel entitled Nausea, where he is examining the presence of nausea within the human consciousness. And that nausea derives from a fundamental recognition. And that recognition is radical, the nature of contingent reality, and the fact that there is a radical opposition between reality, that contingent reality out there, and the demands of my rationality. But when I look at the world and I have to make certain expectations, this is not what I find in the world. The world is very different than what I think the world ought to be like. There's an irrationality about the world. In fact, there's an obscenity about the world, an absurdity about the world. In fact, Sartre was one of the founders of this whole philosophy of absurdism. The world makes no sense. The world is absurd. Well, it's a very modern kind of philosophizing. And it has its correspondence in a book like Ecclesiastes. Right? That is the theme of Ecclesiastes, right? Ecclesiastes, even though Ecclesiastes ends with a commitment to God, right? What is the whole nature of life, that we should serve God and give glory to Him and so on. When you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it's really about the vanity of human existence, the meaninglessness of human existence, the life of a man equivalent to the life of a dog, uncertainty as to whether there's any spirit that goes up and goes elsewhere after death, right? The book of Ecclesiastes is a powerful, ancient philosophical statement about the absurdity of human existence, which is called vanity, which is translated as vanity. Essentially, there's a whole school of existential thinkers that are talking about the absurdity of life. And that brings us to Albert Camus, who won a Nobel Prize for Literature. He was an ex-footballer, won a Nobel Prize for Literature, and wrote a number of very significant books. In the myth of Sisyphus, the myth of Sisyphus is the myth of a Greek hero who is condemned by the gods because of his hubris. Remember, we talked about hubris in the first part of the course. Challenges the gods. He's condemned by the gods. He's condemned to roll a stone up a mountain. When he reaches the top of the mountain, the stone rolls back down, and he has to go back and roll it back up the mountain. And very interestingly, Camus examines that from a philosophical standpoint. That is an image of the absurdity of human life. Camus also is an atheist, so he doesn't critique the gods for condemning man to that. He says that's the nature of human being and human existence. It is absurd. It is meaningless. However, he says that my responsibility as a rebel, he wrote a book called The Rebel also, I rebel, therefore I exist, he says. My responsibility as a rebel is to rebel against the absurdity of life, against the very irrationality and obscenity that Sartre talks about. That my responsibility is now to create positive values in life. And interestingly enough, in the image that he unfolds of Sisyphus pushing that stone up the mountain, he says when Sisyphus reaches the top of the mountain, he releases the stone and it rolls back down the hill. Sisyphus laughs. And in laughing, there's a triumph over the gods. The gods think that they are punishing, but they are not punishing them. In other words, life is meaningless, but I can create meaning in life. I can bring meaning into life. I rebel, therefore I exist. I rebel against this condition in which I find myself. So we are free. We are condemned to be free. Camus is seeing, like Sartre, that we are condemned to be free in a world of meaninglessness. But he goes further than Sartre and sees the individual as having a responsibility to bring meaning and value to human existence.